Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Wound Care Innovation, the Call to Clinical Action. It's great to see so many people on the webinar today, and I hope wherever you're joining us from, you're all staying safe and well. My name is Josh Dance. I'm Senior Vice President with LSX Leaders in London, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar, the next in our Medical Device Innovation series in partnership with MCRA. I'll shortly be handing over to our expert speakers from MCRA, but very briefly, while we wait for everyone to join, if anyone's running a little late, and in case there are any newcomers to LSX in this series, we at LSX, or Life Science Executives, are a community and network of executives in the life sciences and healthcare space. We work with executives from medtech, health tech, and biotech businesses, big pharma and other commercial leaders, the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as other key stakeholders. Some of you may know us from events you might have attended, our industry-leading conferences, partner events, showcases that we run in Europe and the US. We're very much hoping, especially with recent news, that we'll be getting back to those events in 2021. But until we can safely do so, we're delighted to still be connecting, informing, educating, and sharing expertise among our community in the digital world. Delighted to again be working with MCRA for the latest in the medical technology webinar series, and indeed the last webinar for 2020. You'll know MCRA is a leading advisory and research partner for the medical device sector, and the firm has a wide, deep array of expertise. Today's focus, of course, is on wound care and the reimbursement for wound care technologies. And you'll be soon hearing from the team about changes in the regulatory landscape for human tissue products and then approaches to collecting clinical evidence, among other things. But before I hand over to our speakers for today, Tonya Dowd, Kevin McGowan, Chelsea Jaworski, Iman Ahmed, and Stacey Gardner. A couple of quick things to mention just before we kick off for how things will run today. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation for any questions that you may have for our speakers. I'd encourage you all to please make use of this time to ask any questions or follow-ups to that presentation. You can ask questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom. And at the end of the presentation for the last 15 minutes or so, we'll look to answer as many as we can. You also have the option, if someone's asked a question that you also wanted to ask, to upvote, and that'll show you're also interested, and we can look to answer those questions first that the people have upvoted. So please do use this function and ask any questions that you have at any point throughout the session. But that's it from me. So now I'll hand you over to the team at MCRA. Tonya.
Great, thank you, Josh, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. As Josh mentioned, I'm Tonya Dowd. I'm the Vice President of Reimbursement, Health Economics, and Market Access at MCRA. And today I am accompanied by my esteemed colleagues who are experts in the field of wound care and who will be delivering this important webinar information today. So I'm happy to introduce Kevin McGowan, Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs, Iman Ahmed, Senior Director of Clinical Affairs, Chelsea Jaworski, Associate Director of Reimbursement, and finally, Stacey Gardner, Clinical Trial Monitor in Clinical Affairs. So the learning objectives really for today's webinar are to understand the evolving reimbursement dynamics and requirements for wound care technologies. Secondly, the changing regulatory landscape for human tissue products is ever evolving, including wound care, and my colleagues will review that today as well. And finally, the increasing imperative for clinical evidence and specifically best practices to collecting endpoints, such as wound change and other patient-reported outcomes or PROMS data. And we'll also review different approaches to collecting evidence beyond a prospective randomized controlled trial. Next slide, please. So MCRA is a full-service CRO, or clinical research organization, which considers the regulatory, reimbursement, clinical evidence, quality, and compliance requirements throughout a product's life cycle, thus making us truly unique in what we're using, and that we're using an integrated approach and working together to develop the regulatory, reimbursement, and clinical evidence generation strategies in parallel. And finally, we continue to work together to generate data that resonate with all relevant stakeholders for products to optimize market uptake. Next slide, please. So the real call to action and the purpose of today's webinar is to really understand the evidence requirements for reimbursement for wound care products and how they've evolved over the past several years. And considering the recent changes in the regulatory landscape, which again, my colleagues will discuss in further detail. We want to review the data. It's important to review the data that demonstrates the impact of the wound care product with health outcomes. And it's not just important, it is truly an imperative, therefore requiring a call to action of manufacturers of these products to truly understand the data that's required to, again, ensure a successful reimbursement plan is developed and executed that includes a solid evidence generation plan, again, in order to achieve market uptake. Next slide, please. So before we delve into the key reimbursement considerations for wound care technologies, let's touch briefly on the fact that wound care is really an umbrella term for a very large space within healthcare. So products that get classified in this umbrella include agents for treating everything from venous and diabetic ulcers to burns, hemostatic agents, and infection control technologies. Each of these products have their own niche regulatory and reimbursement considerations that could, in fact, be the subject of their own individual webinars because it is so complex. But for today's purpose, we are going to present really a general overview of the considerations that apply to the space as a whole. Next slide, please. So we'll go into the reimbursement considerations. And when we consider reimbursement, we always want to ground ourselves in the three key fundamentals, and that is coverage, coding, and payment. And these are all interrelated, but truly not interdependent, meaning that you can have one without the other. So we never want to look at the reimbursement strategy as one over the other and just with a scope of looking at one. So as an example, we have a code. You may have a code, but no coverage. So we'll start the coding and payment constructs and go through those details for wound care technology specifically. And I'll now pass the presentation over to my colleague, Chelsea Jaworski.
Thank you, Tanya. So there's specific types of code sets that are provided for ICD-10 diagnosis codes, procedure codes, which are established through the AMA, and product-specific codes, the HCPCS codes, that are established by CMS, or Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Next slide. The Healthcare Common Procedure Coding System, or HCPCS code, which you're all familiar with for your wound care products, are level 2 HCPCS codes, which are maintained by CMS. They identify product supplies and services which are not included in CPT. These can be either permanent national codes maintained by CMS or temporary national codes maintained also by CMS. Next slide. We're going to begin with the Medicare fee for service for the physician office. The physician fee schedule and the method, which is the relative value unit assigned to CPT codes initially. Next slide. So for the physician coding set, the physician's office can bill for surgical prep coding, application coding, along with the HCPCS coding. The surgical prep coding, you have a little snippet here of it goes from 15002 through 15005. The application coding is it depends on the anatomical region. So example 15273 is the application to skin graft to the trunk, arm, or legs, as opposed to going down to 15277 is the face, scalp, eyelids, mouth, etc. An example below is the HCPCS coding, a little snippet of the numerous amounts of skin products available. The code obviously depends upon the anatomical region. However, most common Physicians like to try and bill for the tissue debridement, but this is not included within the application codes. Therefore, it's not separately reported or reimbursed. Next slide. The Medicare payment for wound care products in a physician's office setting. Again, it's the CPT code plus the HCPCS code, which is the Q code, and that equals the payment. It is good to mention, if you go back for 1 second, sorry. Good to mention the Medicare National Average Sales Price Rate file payment and WAC are included within the HCPCS code, invoice, as well as specific pricing by Medicare Administrative Contractors, which is the MACs, which is proprietary information. However, if you do have an ASP, those are reported on a quarterly basis through the individual MACs. Next slide. Just to dive deep a little bit into the average sales price, the average sales price is the payment to providers plus 6%. The hospital outpatient and ASC or ambulatory surgery center skin substitutes with the pricing information, but without claims data to calculate a geometric mean unit cost or a MUC or product per day cost, which is a PDC. Those are assigned to either a high cost or a low cost category based on the product's average sale price, ASP, plus the 6% payment. The ASP data for Part B drugs and biologics is accepted via the online ASP data collection system. The manufacturers must calculate the ASP every quarter and submit to CMS within 30 days of the close of the quarter. For any products listed on the ASP file, the rate is applicable to all MACs and therefore no adjustment for wage index or any percentage added to the rate. The Medicare Administrative Contractors develop payment allowance limits for covered drugs when CMS does not supply the payment allowance limit on the ASP. Next slide. The wholesale acquisition cost, otherwise known as WAC, is the manufacturer's list price for a product. If there is not an ASP available, the CMS will use the WAC plus 3% to assign a product to either the high or low cost category. For new products that initially lack the ASP data, Medicare pays the WAC plus 3% for the first 2 to 3 quarters the product is on the market. CMS is then able to collect the ASP data and set payments. The contractors follow the methodology for calculating the average wholesale price, but substitute WAC for the AWP, and the payment limit is 106% of the lesser of the lowest priced brand or median generic WAC. Next slide. Moving on to the payment methods for hospital inpatient and hospital outpatient. Next slide. Again, skin substitute products are divided into 2 groups for packaging purposes, the high cost and low cost. High cost meaning you can bill under the CPT categories 15271 through 15278, whereas low cost would have to bill under a C code, the C5271 through C5278. So this assignment guide payment for skin substitute products that do not qualify for how a hospital outpatient pass-through status are instead packaged into the outpatient payment for the associated skin substitutes application procedure. It's also implemented into the ASC payment system. The Medicare final rule came out just about a week and a half ago. And for 2021, any skin substitute product that was assigned to the high cost group in 2020 is assigned to the high cost group for 2021, regardless of whether it exceeds or falls below the 2021 MUC or PDC threshold. Additionally, the 2021 thresholds, CMS analyzed the calendar year 2019 claims data to calculate the MUC threshold and the PDC threshold. And the final calendar year 2021 MUC threshold is now going to be $48 per square centimeter. And the final 2021 PDC threshold is now going to be $949. Next slide. And now we're going to speak a little bit about the coverage. As we know, again, if you have coding and payment, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be provided coverage either through Medicare or through commercial payers. So the FDA and the payer and provider stakeholder requirements are different. The FDA is evaluating the device. They want to see the efficacy and really see if the benefits outweigh the risks. Commercial payers, example, above United Healthcare, they evaluate the impact the device has on health outcomes and how it demonstrates the effectiveness and overall patient outcomes. Does the product improve the health outcomes or provide benefits relative enough to establish alternatives to the standard of care with published evidence? So an end-to-end evidence generation strategy is necessary to meet all stakeholder requirements. Next slide. Most commercial payers require a technology evaluation criteria, and that your particular technology must fall under and meet all of this criteria in order to provide coverage. Examples: the technology must have final approval from the appropriate governmental regulatory bodies. The scientific evidence must permit conclusions concerning the effect of the technology on health outcomes. The technology must improve the net health outcomes, and the technology must be as beneficial as any established alternatives, meaning particular technologies that they already provide coverage for and outlined in their medical policy. And the improvement must be attainable outside the investigational setting. Next slide. In reimbursement and MCRA throughout, we commonly use our Life Sciences Expert Advisory Panel. Specifically for payer engagement activities, we use the panel members because they are comprised of both current and former medical directors on medical policy committees. So we engage them, particularly for this webinar, and pose the question to them about the number of wound care products out there and evidence generation plans that should be established. So this is coming from one of the panel members, that the wound care products have become problematic for payers. There's a proliferation of them, which will be outlined a little bit further in the presentation. The number is sort of daunting. It's been difficult for payers to get their arms around it. In terms of evidence, there's been a slow evolution of better studies with appropriate design, which is often a randomized control trial, isolating the new variable, the wound care product, and sufficient length of follow-up also to determine the healing time, which are critical in commercial payer adoption. Next slide. So Medicare formal coverage mechanisms, obviously there's not currently an NCD out there for wound care products. However, there are still a few local coverage determinations in certain jurisdictions that have established LCDs or LCAs, local coverage articles, in reference to wound care technologies. Next slide. It's really been an evolution of MAC coverage for skin substitutes or wound care products just in the last 5 years. Originally, the majority of the local coverage determinations, the different jurisdictions had wound care LCDs established for the wound care products. Some have retired these particular LCDs, LCAs, within the last few years. There is yet another one that is establishing. They retired in 2015, and now they are establishing a new LCD due to the fact of the numerous amount of technologies coming on the market under the wound care space. So the LCDs are in place to limit and not grant coverage. Most of the claims that are submitted to the local MACs are reviewed on a case-by-case basis for medical necessity. Next slide. Commercial payers. So because there is a wide variety of wound care options on the market, evidence is key when evaluating a new technology that comes on board. Each product is assessed on its own merits regarding the peer-reviewed literature. So the payers currently are seeking randomized controlled trials, recommending that they be well designed with strong methodology and double blinding, large patient population, meaning that the N should be over 100 patients, along with long-term follow-up. Increasingly stringent data requirements have been put in place in recent years as more and more wound care products enter the market with varied efficacy and safety data. Next slide. Some examples of positive coverage and the reason why they have positive coverage currently. And keep in mind, there is only a handful of technologies, wound care products out there for specific indications outlined in medical policies that have been granted coverage. So example, Dermograph is a covered technology. They have a PMA, a pre-market approval. They have multiple RCTs, a well-designed studies with strong methodology and blinding. Their largest RCT, again, is over 355 patients. So that surpasses the 100 patient mark outlined by some of the commercial payers. The 12 weeks to 14-month follow-up periods, as opposed to the normal 6 weeks. And Apligraph is yet another covered product due to the large RCT population and specific indications outlined through those RCTs for venous insufficiency and or DFU. Again, a PMA approval. Next slide. We put this slide in here to show an example of a particular Aetna's skin substitute policy outlining all of the products that are currently on the market that are considered experimental investigational. And this is due to the fact that the majority of these technologies do not have the peer-reviewed published literature. They're not meeting the net health outcomes according to the health technology assessments performed by each individual commercial payer. Randomized controlled trials, or again, published literature is necessary in order to provide coverage to for your particular technology. Next slide. And again, the coverage evidence requirements, obviously different between the FDA and what is required from not only Medicare, but mostly commercial payers. Again, the RCT greater than 100 has to be well designed. You need peer-reviewed literature on these studies. Whereas regulatory, most of the products that you just saw outlined in the previous slide for the HCTP didn't require any study. Therefore, that's why you see the majority of those products considered experimental investigational moving forward for the commercial payers. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kevin McGowan.
Thanks, Chelsea. Today, I'm going to discuss FDA's regulation of human cell and tissue products and some recent changes to FDA's enforcement of these products, specifically those in the wound care space. As part of this discussion, I'm going to cover various aspects of human cell and tissue product regulation, particularly 361 human cell and tissue products, and the concepts of minimal manipulation and homologous use. Next slide. Human cell and tissue products are articles containing or consisting of human cells or tissues that are intended for implantation, transplantation, infusion, or transfer into a human recipient. FDA regulates these products using a risk-based approach to allow access for these products while balancing patient safety. Next slide. Human cell and tissue products fall into two regulatory tiers. 361 tissues meet certain requirements and are exempt from pre-market review, whereas 351 tissues are regulated under normal FDA pre-market review as drugs, devices, biologics, or combination products. However, both are required to meet tissue regulations to control communicable diseases. Next slide. Some human-based products are not covered by human cell and tissue product regulations, mostly because they are regulated separately, such as organs for transplant and blood products. Of note, amniotic fluid is not considered by FDA to be a human cell and tissue product, as it meets the secreted product exemption. As stated before, Section 361 human cell and tissue products are exempted from pre-market review if they meet certain criteria, as outlined on this slide. These four criteria are: they must be minimally manipulated, intended for homologous use, and we'll describe these two definitions later in the presentation, as these definitions are the most subjective to interpretation. The third portion is not to be used in combination with another article. And fourthly, there are limitations on the use of metabolically active cells. Note that these criteria take into account both the construction of the product and the intended use, and a product could meet the criteria for one intended use and not for another. As I mentioned before, if a company has a product that meets the Section 361 criteria, no pre-market review is required, and there are no clinical data requirements prior to marketing. However, the FDA may audit the company and its records to determine if the product meets the criteria for Section 361. And if it does not believe that it does so, FDA can request the product be removed from the market until it undergoes pre-market review. Listed here are a few examples of Section 361 products, including skin grafts. Note that these products under 361 are using a specific design and indication for use. A key aspect of Section 361 products is, since there is no pre-market review, FDA only evaluates this during a post-market inspection. You can submit to FDA to review this pre-market through the tissue reference group, but this is not common. Prior to 2014, FDA's guidance on meeting the Section 361 criteria was somewhat limited, particularly related to the minimal manipulation and homologous use items. Greater insight could primarily be gained from the tissue reference group website and warnings and untitled letters that were published. However, in 2014 and 2015, FDA released guidance documents that outlined its interpretation of the minimal manipulation and homologous use items. These interpretations were quite limited, giving detailed examples of FDA's thinking. Following a public comment period, FDA released final guidance on this topic in 2017. But FDA stated that they would use enforcement discretion through November of 2020 to give companies the time to gather clinical data and discuss with FDA future marketing for these products. In July of this year, due to COVID-19, FDA revised the guidance to the intention of exercising enforcement discretion through May 2020. Now, these FDA changes to the interpretation of the 361 human cell and tissue products regulations may increase the types of products requiring pre-market review and clinical data collection. Next, let's dig into some of the specifics of this guidance document and how FDA defines the terms minimal manipulation and homologous use. To start, FDA places tissues into two buckets: structural tissues and cells, non-structural tissues. FDA does this to outline the basic function of these types of tissues. And while tissues may have both structural and metabolic processes, the distribution of primary function is used for the forthcoming definitions. Minimal manipulation is defined as processes that do not alter a tissue's original relevant characteristics. FDA considers this differently for structural and non-structural tissues. For structural tissues, this is based on if the processing removes any of the key structural elements of that tissue. For example, meshing and cryopreservation of skin is considered to be minimal manipulation. However, while grinding into particles is not. For cellular tissues, this is based on if the processing alters the biological properties of the tissue. For example, cell selection is considered minimal manipulation, while cell culture and expansion is not, because the cell culture and expansion could lead to changes in the cellular's biological properties. Prior to 2017, FDA's interpretation of this concept was not well defined, leading companies to potentially use different thought processes when developing products based on human cell and tissue products than FDA would have used. For the homologous use component, FDA outlines that the tissue must perform the same basic function, although this function need not be in the same anatomical location. For example, adipose tissue as a structural tissue is homologous use in filling voids. However, using adipose tissue to regenerate cartilage does not perform the same basic function as outlined in the guidance document. Amniotic membrane is a product that depending on its intended use, may meet the homologous use criteria or not. In its use as a wound covering, this is considered by FDA to be a homologous use based upon the properties of amniotic membrane. When you take that to wound healing, however, FDA thinks of this as a non-homologous use of that tissue. So the intended use is critical in this determination of homologous use. As with minimal manipulation, the definitions provided by FDA in the revised guidance for homologous use provide a more limited definition than companies were applying in many instances. So shifting gears, so what happens when a product does not meet the criteria for a 361 product? The product ultimately has to follow a typical drug, device, or biologic pre-market review. Some example of products that have taken this pathway are outlined here above. So when a tissue product follows a pre-market review pathway, clinical data is usually a key element in that pre-market review. And I've outlined two of those processes here for both Class 3 medical devices and for biologics. For a Class 3 medical device, this is usually a single pivotal study for safety and effectiveness. But however, for a biologic, the criteria is slightly different. It is requiring two adequate and well-controlled clinical studies because the regulations are defined differently for devices and biologics. So for products that require pre-market clinical data, the collection of that data is critical to marking that technology. And a number of products through FDA's different interpretation of the human cell and tissue product guidelines are now falling into that bucket of products that might require clinical data. And now I'd like to turn it over to Stacy Gardner.
Thanks, Kevin. In this segment, we'll cover some clinical study design and study execution guidance that can help you if you're in a position where you need to gather clinical evidence, either for regulatory approval or for reimbursement coverage. There are many types of studies that can be run in order to collect data to support your technology. When selecting a study design, it is important to think about why you are running this study. Is it required by the FDA for product approval? If so, there are different pathways that you need to consider for clinical data, depending on if the product is regulated as a device or biologic. If the product is considered to be a device, you will need to run a pivotal study under an IDE. The FDA looks for valid scientific evidence for a medical device. It is sometimes possible to seek regulatory approval without a randomized controlled trial for a medical device. For example, if there's a well-defined historical control arm available in the literature. It is important to note that if you are an early stage company, you may also need to run a smaller pilot study prior to your pivotal study to evaluate product feasibility, establish proof of concept, or assess product safety before the FDA will grant approval for a larger clinical population. However, if the product is a biologic, FDA requires 2 adequate and well-controlled studies. Single-arm studies and non-randomized trial designs will generally not meet the statistical requirements set forth by the FDA for a biologic. In both cases, sample size justifications and formal statistical analysis plans are necessary to include at the study design onset. Next slide. If data is required to provide clinical evidence to payers or for marketing to physicians and other commercial stakeholders, such as hospital purchasing committees, there are other clinical evidence gathering approaches that a company may consider. It is important to note upfront that as with the FDA, Medicare and commercial payers favor clinical data obtained through a randomized controlled study that is well powered to evaluate the primary and secondary endpoints. An RCT design with a minimum N of at least 100 patients, preferably up to 300 patients, and at least 1 to 2 years worth of follow-up data is always treated as the gold standard by Medicare and commercial payers. The comparator should be the best available standard of care, or even better, a direct competitor to permit a conclusion on superiority. However, as we all know, RCTs require a significant financial outlay and may not be affordable for smaller companies that are looking to get a foot in the market. In such cases, there are several other data analysis options that a company may consider to secure coverage, and they may want to consider these different approaches for different payer groups. Your first option is to consider conducting a large, non-randomized post-market study to collect prospective data on the use of the technology. You may also choose to set up a registry to collect prospective real-world data on the use of the technology. These types of studies will require IRB approval and patient consents. A second option is to collect retrospective data if you want to answer a specific question about your product by looking at data that has already been generated through the use of your product in hospitals and clinics. Your sales team can be vital in helping you identify these high-volume users who can be approached for permission to collect product use and outcomes data from their EMRs. A retrospective study of this nature is both cheaper and faster than prospective studies. However, it might not allow for the collection of patient-reported outcomes that you can typically ensure are collected in a prospective study. The retrospective data may have some holes in it also, since it's never been run under a clinical protocol. An example is that follow-up time points may differ between patients and between physicians, as not all physicians practice the same, raising some challenges for the pullability of the data at a later time point. Retrospective collection typically requires IRB approval, but does not require collecting patient consent, since there is less than minimal risk to the subjects from the review of their data, provided that all data collected is de-identified and no PHI is collected. Another option is to collect and analyze data from commercially available clinical databases, such as Premier or Pearl Driver. You can license these types of data sets. It's often costly, but can be a huge time saver if a company has the funds and data is available. I will note these are claims databases, not real-world patient databases. The last option to evaluate are patient-reported outcomes and look at the data from healthcare providers about how the use, it's physician-reported outcomes, how the use of a technology influences ease of use, efficiency, healthcare utilization metrics, etc. This type of data collection also doesn't require IRB approval or patient consent. And as Chelsea previously mentioned, MCRA's reimbursement and health economic advisors have significant experience guiding companies on how to navigate these options and put together the market access plan that works best for you. They have experience in developing coverage criteria for new and novel techniques, as well as the specific evidence that is needed for coverage. They can also advise wound care companies on the value proposition that resonates with multiple stakeholders. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Aman Ahmad, who will discuss the key study design considerations and wound care study challenges.
Thanks, Stacey. So once you've defined the type of study that meets your needs, in order to run a successful trial, it's important to prepare a carefully thought out study protocol. The first thing that a company should outline is the precise wound characteristics that define their target patient population, which should then be used to create the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study. They should also clearly identify the required product dosage and use timeline for effectiveness. This information is typically derived from the results of your preclinical testing and/or the results of a pilot study if you had to conduct one. The next thing you want to think about and define is any concomitant wound treatments that are contraindicated because they would interfere with the study results. As an example, most trials do not permit the use of wound dressings containing colloidal silver, because even though silver has well-known wound healing and infection prevention properties, silver can denature certain products and impede their mechanism of action. You also want to clearly spell out any products or therapies that patients will be required to use during the study to assist with the healing process. As an example, many ulcer studies require patients to comply with offloading until the ulcer heals because weight bearing has a tremendous impact on ulcer healing. Offloading is such an important consideration, in fact, that sponsors sometimes go so far as to specify the exact type of boot that patients should receive so as to remove variations in the level of offloading between different boots. Next, in order to remove bias in the evaluation of your primary endpoint, you should always consider including the use of an independent blinded wound adjudicator to assess wound closure. It is also recommended that an independent medical monitor or DSMB be used to review safety events during the study and help characterize the product safety profile. All of these things go a long way towards improving the data's credibility in the eyes of FDA, Medicare, and private payers. Next slide, please. We know from our experience that wound care studies face certain unique challenges when it comes to study execution. MCRA's clinical team can help with strategies to overcome these challenges based on lessons we've learned from the studies we've run. Most wound studies require weekly or bi-weekly clinic visits for dressing changes and treatment, and patients must adhere to a strict treatment regimen at home between visits. We know that patients are more likely to return for these weekly visits and be compliant with at-home care while their pain is acute. And we know that as they improve, they may miss a visit here and there and also start to be less compliant with their at-home care, which leads to a reduction in the treatment effect. Due to time and travel constraints, they may also be tempted to drop out of the study once they see that they're healing, which makes it hard for companies to gather long-term follow-up data, which is ironically, as you've heard from my colleagues, the data that FDA and payers are most interested in. These patient compliance and retention challenges can all be addressed by offering incentives such as gift cards at each follow-up visit to incentivize patients to come in, and by structuring your study to allow for remote data collection via virtual healthcare visits using some of the technologies I'll be talking about a little later. Larger gift card amounts should always be offered for important milestone visits that are tied to one or more of your protocol endpoints in order to increase the likelihood that patients will return at those time points. And as a sponsor, you can also offer patient education leaflets that stress the importance of compliance in patients' healing journeys and encourage the site staff to review this message with them at every visit. Studies that have an open label control arm rather than a placebo face one other challenge. Patients with chronic wounds like diabetic ulcers and recurrent infections are looking to receive a novel treatment because they've tried everything else and are very familiar with all of the therapies that fall under standard of care. They do not want to receive a standard of care treatment that isn't efficacious, and so studies with unblinded control arms often face serious recruitment challenges. If your study will not be using a competitive product that is well advertised for its efficacy, you may consider paying patients in the comparator arm more than patients in the treatment arm. I'm sure this might come as a surprise to many folks in the audience, but some of the noteworthy IRBs that MCRA has worked with has verified that this is an acceptable way of compensating study participants since they're technically receiving a product of lesser therapeutic value. Another possible solution to consider is a crossover study design where patients can receive the novel product after they complete their participation in the control arm. The only caveat here is that this strategy can only be applied once your product is commercially available, since it cannot be offered while it is still regarded as experimental or investigational. Moving on to site challenges, most of the healthcare centers that have high volumes of wound care patients are small wound clinics or podiatrist offices. And while these centers may appear to be ideal places for recruiting patients and running a new wound care study, many of them sadly lack the financial ability to employ a dedicated team of researchers, and they often don't have a lot of research experience. Having worked with and vetted a lot of sites, MCRA can recommend investigators that have an adequate patient volume, as well as a research infrastructure required for high quality data collection. These sites have the experience to overcome the study challenges we've been talking about so far, including careful patient education to support compliance and the expertise required to perform accurate wound assessments. Most wound studies have primary study endpoints that involve the assessment of wound healing and wound size reduction. and require a consistent and objective method to document this data. The images in this slide highlight the difficulties in wound size measurement, particularly for irregularly shaped wounds. As you can see in this graphic, depending on where you draw the axes on the wound, you can end up with 3 entirely different measurements for its surface area. Measurement errors of this nature can lead to ineligible patients being mistakenly enrolled in a study or eligible patients being screened out. They can also introduce noise in the data and make it appear as though wound size fluctuates over time. Experienced sites try to always have the same person assess a patient at all of their follow-up time points and to record how they made the initial measurements so that they can try and use the same axes for subsequent visits. However, we know very well that despite best efforts, this approach will always be prone to some degree of subjectivity and human error. And we also know that measurement accuracy is proportional to the time invested. Getting a truly accurate measurement can, believe it or not, take up to 10 minutes, which is why many untrained sites fail at doing this well. To complicate things further, one has to also consider the fact that wound shape may also change as the wound heals. Knowing these challenges, MCRA's wound care experts recommend the use of a digital wound measurement technology to mitigate these risks if your research budget allows for this investment. There are a number of wound measurement platforms on the market today that are designed specifically for use in clinical studies. These platforms utilize proprietary cameras or smartphone technology to capture wound images, and the images are used to perform automated measurements with the help of AI. Patients love them because they remove that need to make contact with the patient's skin, and they remove the discomfort that was caused by having someone press a ruler against the wound to measure it manually. The other major advantage that the software offers is the ability to use AI to trace the wound perimeter and automatically calculate the area, depth, and volume of the region traced. Last but not least, as shown in the image on the right, this technology also has the capability to perform 3D qualitative analysis and differentiate areas of slough, granulation, necrosis, and epithelialization in different regions of the wound. And so, in summary, these technologies make it possible for companies to collect highly accurate qualitative and quantitative wound data and avoid data issues created through human error on the part of the sites or independent wound adjudicators. Some of these platforms also have additional capabilities, such as integration with sites' EMR systems, integration with your EDC platform, and the availability of patient apps that can be downloaded and used on a smartphone. These advanced solutions can be especially helpful for addressing the patient retention issues that I mentioned earlier, since they give sites a tool to perform remote study visits. On the day of a study visit, patients can receive reminders from the site to log onto the app on their phones and take photos of their wound. This technology allows photos to be uploaded from the phones to the cloud in as little as 15 seconds, and these images can be reviewed by the investigator in real time as part of a telehealth visit. The final images and wound measurements get archived in the investigator's EMR and in the EDC and can easily be accessed by the site staff to track the patient's healing trajectory. Patients can also view their healing improvement in the app and monitor their own progress, which motivates them to continue following product use guidelines. Some products also allow for collection of patient-reported outcomes such as VAS pain scores and quality of life scores through the app. These capabilities are of great value in this present era due to COVID, as they can help companies design hybrid trials and limit the number of inpatient follow-up visits that are required of trial participants. With that, we conclude our presentation for today. On behalf of the team in MCRA, I'd like to extend a very warm thank you to everyone for joining us for what we hope was an informative review of the wound care regulatory, reimbursement, and clinical landscape. I'll now turn things over to Alyssa Howard, MCRA's Senior Director of Business Development, for the question and answer segment of this webinar.
Great, thanks Aman, and thanks to the MCRA team for all of that great content. So we will get through as many of the questions that are coming in as possible. And for any that we can't get to in the time that we have left, we will certainly follow up offline with an answer. And for those that are anonymous, we encourage you to reach out to us and we will definitely address your question if we can't do it live. So let me start going down and make sure that you put your question in the Q&A box now if you would like it to be addressed. So the first question, what are ways to discuss the clinical study protocols with private payers and CMS before starting the outcome studies to understand what they want? How do we get access to the payers? And maybe Chelsea, do you want to take that question?
Sure, thanks, Alyssa. So in reimbursement, we have payer engagement activities where we work closely with commercial payers, Medicare, Medicaid, in establishing and providing education for your technology in order to be incorporated into their medical policy for coverage. Obviously, this is all about evidence generation and knowing what that particular payer is looking for in order to provide coverage. We also have the Life Sciences Expert Advisory Panel, which I mentioned in the presentation, which is comprised of both current and former medical directors that sat on the medical policy committees for these commercial payers, where we can gain tremendous insight from in order to help in developing the evidence generation plan for coverage.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. How about, are the clinical data obtained outside of the US considered by the payers? Maybe Tanya, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yes. It used to be in the past that US payers did not consider OUS generated data. However, they have evolved over the years, and in particular, Aetna, for example, and Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield does consider data from OUS studies, and in particular with the NICE Health Technology Assessment Group and what they've actually published. But it is necessary for full market adoption and for coverage to also generate evidence for US specific patients and in the US.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tanya. Hi there, thanks for today. Are there any digital wound measurement vendors that MCRA recommends? Aman or Stacy, could you address that question?
Sorry, I was on mute. There are a couple options available. They obviously goes back to EMR systems and contracting with those folks. And you know, it would be a pay-to-play kind of thing, but there's definitely between the U.S. Wound Registry and some of the EMR companies, some data available.
Okay, thank you. A question for Kevin. Do you think that FDA will stick to the new timeline for enforcement discretion?
Thanks for the question. I think it's unclear at this moment. I think prior to COVID, we had heard from the FDA that they were planning on sticking to the prior deadline, and we're waiting for companies to provide them with some information on what their plans were. So I think any delay in that deadline would be more COVID related than giving companies more time to provide more evidence.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Let me go through some of these others. Looks like the home health solutions, Aman, I think you answered that one live already. I think some of these, the questions coming in about pricing, I think these are a little bit more complex, and we can certainly schedule time to go through all of the specific questions about the pricing. So if you want to reach out, we'll be sending an email following the webinar if you want to respond to that, and we'll set up some time to kind of walk through how that's determined. Let's see what else we have. Can you recommend a wound measurement system? Aman or Stacy?
Yeah, so there are two platforms on the market that we've worked with. There are also a number of others, one being the Iran's platform and the other being the Tissue Analytics platform.
Yeah, and Iran's owns and offers the use of a handheld camera that's known as a Silhouette Star, which can be combined with their platform. It's called Silhouette Central, which allows for quantitative and qualitative wound assessments, so area, perimeter, etc. Some of the things that I covered in my presentation. They also allow the capability for images to be uploaded into an EDC, and they also offer a patient app, I believe. Tissue Analytics is the second company that Stacey mentioned, excuse me. They definitely offer a patient app and definitely have EMR integration, which is a huge plus point for sites, right? It spares them the time needed to record all of the data. And that's one of the most popular commercially available options in the United States, at least. I believe they have some European capability. We could help you reach out to them and make an introduction if you'd like.
Great, thank you, Aman. If we get a Q code for our wound care product, will the payers automatically cover / pay for it? Tanya, do you want to take that one?
Sure, and thanks for the question. You know, as we started out the presentation with, you know, again, looking at the coding, coverage, and payment, the 3 key fundamentals, and again, them all really interacting as you know, really interdependent concepts. Just because you have a Q code doesn't mean the payers will cover and or pay for the technology. And it's important to understand that there are different requirements, data requirements, that CMS looks at to establish a HCPCS code versus what the payers will look at, including CMS, to develop coverage or payment for the technology. So in effect, the left hand truly isn't talking to the right hand, if you will. So definitely need to consider, just because you have a Q code and you've gotten over that hurdle, making sure that you do achieve and establish the right evidence that will support the medical necessity and or the reasonable and necessary nature of the technology with the payers for coverage.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Another one for you, Tanya, I think here. Who can help me determine what evidence is needed and the design of the study?
Yeah, and I think Chelsea touched on this earlier with regard to our deep and trusted advisor relationships, even with the commercial payers, the Medicaid agencies, as well as the Medicare contractors and CMS. We regularly engage with those entities for, really to dialogue and to present data for established products. But we also, in turn, have relationships where we are able to go to the individual payers to really purport a technology and to really understand what are they looking for in terms of evidentiary requirements, not only in wound care, but elsewhere as well in terms of implantables and other technologies. And then in addition to that, as Chelsea mentioned, we have at MCRA the Life Sciences Expert Advisory Panel, which consists of former payer medical directors who can actually assist and take deep dives into helping develop clinical study protocols and the evidence generation plan in total that will resonate with the payer medical directors across the country. So that's a really, I think, a valuable, very valuable service that MCRA provides.
Great, thank you, Tanya.
Mm-hmm.
Let me.
Melissa, I see a question on here about when we say that a randomized control trial should have more than 100 patients. Yep. Are we referring to the total including placebo control, or are we referring just to the active arm? We did mean that the active treatment group should have a minimum of 100 patients. That is the threshold for clinical evidence that is recommended both for payers and for regulatory agencies. And as you also heard, a higher N is always beneficial, going up to as much as 300 if possible. It was a great question.
Great, thank you, Aman. So I think we're at time now. There's a few more questions coming in. A lot of them are from anonymous attendees. So again, we're going to send out an email to everybody that did attend today. And if you want to get in contact with MCRA, you can reach out to us at info@micra.com. The email address is here on the screen. Please send over your questions. And if we can't address it via email, we are happy to set up a call with the team to talk more specifically, especially about some of these more complex questions coming in. But Let me hand it back over to Josh at LSX to kind of finish things up. And thank you everybody for your time today.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. Yeah, thank you to everyone who joined us today, and particularly obviously to Tonya, Kevin, Chelsea, Iman, and Stacey for sharing their expertise with you all today. As Alyssa said there, I'm sure they'd be very happy to discuss the content of the presentation and any ways they'd be able to help you and your businesses after the webinar through the ways that Alyssa said. We will be sending out an email ourselves with a link to the presentation slides and to the full recorded webinar as well, so you can sort of re-listen or dig in, or for those who weren't able to log in at this time as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the last of our webinar series for 2020, but do look out for the next in the series that we're running with MCRA, which should actually be taking place, I should say, as part of our MedTech Leaders Agenda at our 7th annual LSX World Congress, which is taking place across the week of February 1st to 5th. The World Congress is our flagship event at LSX. We bring together medtech, health tech, biotech businesses with investors, big pharma, big medtech, big tech, and other key stakeholders across the sort of healthcare innovation ecosystem. So there'll be, we're expecting 2,000 plus attendees for across the week. There's 3 tracks of content, company showcases, CEO forums, and critically 2 full weeks of video one-to-one partnering to sort of connect and meet people in the virtual world, all within one virtual event platform. So that next webinar from MCRA will be in there. Please do get in touch if you'd like to find out any more about that event, or indeed if you're interested in signing up for the MCRA webinar that's a part of it, as I mentioned. But that's it for now. Thanks again to all of our speakers and to all of you for joining us today. Keep healthy and well, and hope to see you all soon.